The stories of imagination are never far. They still reside in us, guiding us ever forward. Join us now as we journey forward into the past. And here is your host, J.C. Riday. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Forward into the Past. I'm your host and narrator, J.C. Riday, and today we're going to be picking up where we left off in the Nick Carter mystery story, The Crime of the French Café, written way back in 1893, exactly as it appeared in the Street and Smith published weekly story paper, The New York Weekly. Now before we head back in time, as it were, I'd like to circle back to something that I had to look up and share with you. In the very first chapter, the very first line as a matter of fact, the author gives the description of the French Café, and that it is located in what he says is the Tenderloin District. To be honest, for me, one of the joys of reading stories like this is finding moments where, as I'm reading aloud, I come across a line that makes me pause and go, "What the hell is this guy talking about?" And I end up going down that proverbial rabbit hole and end up with useless trivia like this, that until I created this podcast, the only time I got to use it is when I would win a game of Trivial Pursuit because I happen to know the definition of a word like jodhpurs. Anyway, back to the point at hand. The writer mentioned the setting of the story as the Tenderloin District. So what's up with that? Honestly, I could probably do a whole episode based on the information I found about this area, but I will condense it as much as I can. As I mentioned just a minute ago, the story was written just before the turn of the 20th century, and it appeared in what was known then as a story paper with the title of The New York Weekly. So, it seems quite obvious that the Nick Carter stories take place in New York City around that particular time. And in that particular time, there was a Tenderloin District in New York City, which existed from around 1870 to approximately 1910. Now, this area was located in Manhattan, and at that time was the home to many glamorous and ritzy hotels, and home to the Theater District before it moved to its current location. The Tenderloin District was bordered on the north by 42nd Street, on the south by 24th Street, on the east by 5th Avenue, and on the west by 7th Avenue. From the northwest corner to the southeast corner ran Broadway. So, in this section of Manhattan, anchored by glamorous hotels and the original Theater District, and just east of Hell's Kitchen, was a centralized entertainment district. Because wherever live theater exists, true back then as well as now, ancillary businesses pop up serving that clientele. The hotels lined Fifth Avenue, big theaters up and down Broadway, and just west of that, up and down 6th and 7th Avenue, were numerous restaurants, cafes, gin joints, dance halls, pool halls, gambling halls, and of course, brothels. There were so many legitimate and illegitimate businesses that police in that area were bribed to look the other way. During this time, any red light district in the United States, meaning of course areas of the city that had houses of ill repute, became known as Tenderloin districts. Okay, JC, that's all well and good, but where did the name come from? Okay. Legend has it that the name came from a New York City police captain by the name of Alexander Clubber Williams. When Clubber Williams was transferred to a police precinct in the heart of this district, he said, "I have been eating chuck steak ever since I have been on the force, and now I'm going to have a bit of tenderloin." Chuck steak, of course, being one of the cheapest cuts of meat, compared to the tenderloin being one of the priciest. And just what made such a change in his eating habits? Of course, all that money flowing everywhere within that district. Clubber Williams retired a millionaire. Now, eventually, The theater district moved further uptown, taking with it all of the entertainment hotspots. The Tenderloin District, as it was now known, eventually became a faded memory, aided with the advent of the First World War, as of course the story papers faded too, and with them our hero, Nick Carter. And so, we move forward into the past again, revisiting the case files of Nick Carter and the crime of the French Cafe. In the last episode, our master detective Nick Carter was visited by a man who claimed that John Jones, the main suspect in the murder of the woman found at the French Cafe, is not who he claims to be. But Gaspard, the head waiter at the cafe, has already identified the man as John Jones. So, who is who? And who is the woman who was murdered at the cafe? Well, let's find out as we delve forward into the past. Chapter 5. Patsy's Tip. Gaspard's declaration produced a stunning effect upon Hammond. At first, he seemed thunderstruck. There was a look in his face which made Nick say to himself, "It isn't true." But whether the accusation was true or false, Nick knew at once that Hammond recognized Gaspard. Yet he couldn't be a regular visitor to the place, because Gaspard had said that he had never seen either of the two men before the fatal evening. Therefore, as Hammond had recognized Gaspard, he must be the man who was in room A, because the man in room B had not seen the head waiter according to Gaspard's story. Hammond, after the first shock of surprise, recovered his nerve wonderfully. He calmly took a chair and sat there in deep thought for nearly 5 minutes. He paid no attention to questions. Finally, he looked up and said, "I don't know why I should try to deny it to you. There is no charge against the man in room A." "None whatever," said Nick. "He is wanted merely as a witness. It occurred to me that you might have some theory of a conspiracy in which both men were concerned. I never thought of it. Then I am not to be put under arrest?" "Certainly not, unless some new evidence appears, and I do not expect it." "Very well. I was the man in room A. And who was the lady?" "I decline to mention her name. She has nothing to do with this case. You will easily understand that I do not wish to bring a lady's name into a tragedy of this kind." "I can understand that. Now, tell me why you feel so sure of this man Jones's innocence. Will you promise to keep me out of this affair as much as you can?" "Why do you wish it? What are you afraid of?" "Well," said Hammond, looking very much embarrassed, "I'm a married man, a very respectable sort of fellow, and the lady with whom I dined was not my wife. It's all right, you know. My wife is not a jealous woman, but the thing would not look well in print. I won't make this public if I can help it, Mr. Hammond. Not that I have much sympathy for you. You shouldn't have been there. But the publicity would annoy your wife and do nobody any good." "Thank you," said Hammond with a grim smile. "Now I will tell my story. There is very little to tell. We arrived before the other party. We heard them go into room B. By and by, I went out into the hall to find the waiter, who didn't answer my ring. I saw this man," pointing to Gaspard, "at the desk, and should have spoken to him. But just then the waiter hove into sight at the end of the hall. So I went back. Just as I was closing the door of our room, I heard the man come out of room B. I didn't see him, but I know that he went down the front stairs, for I heard his footsteps, and also heard the door shut. The waiter came in, and finally went out again. We were just ready to leave the place when we heard the pistol shot in the other room. Then we got out of the house just as fast as we could. It was cowardly, perhaps, but I knew that something terrible had happened, and I didn't want to be mixed up in it. Of course, I wanted to keep the lady out of it, too, and, well, you can see that there were many reasons why I should have decided to make tracks." "You know that the man was not in room B when the shot was fired?" said Nick. "I'm sure of it." "He might have come back." "No. The front door makes a loud noise when it is shut. I should have heard him if he had come in that way. And if he had come the other way, this man would have seen him. You didn't see him at all, did you?
No.
So you can't say whether Jones was the man?
No. But I'm sure he wasn't the murderer.
You think it was suicide?
I'm sure of it. How could it have been anything else? The woman was alone.
There might have been somebody else in the room.
No, our waiter told us that the party consisted of only two.
You mean Corbett?
I believe that's his name, the fellow who disappeared.
How do you account for his disappearance?
I don't. But perhaps he was afraid of being mixed up in the affair. He may have had a record which won't permit him to go before the police, even as a witness.
How could he have got that cab?
I've thought a good deal about that. It was mentioned in the papers. I believe he may have slipped out the front way, called the cab, and then gone back to get something. Perhaps he went back for his clothes, but didn't dare take them.
And how about the cabman's story of the man who engaged the cab?
The cabman's a liar. That's plain enough.
I'm afraid he is. Now, Mr. Hammond, could either Corbett or this man Gaspard have got into room B without your knowing it?
Easily. Great heavens, I never thought of that. One of them may be the murderer.
Gaspard at these words turned white as a sheet. He was so frightened that his English, which was usually very fluent, deserted him, and he mumbled protestations of innocence in his mother tongue. Thank you, Mr. Hammond, said Nick, without appearing to notice Gaspard's distress. I have no more questions to ask, but I would be obliged to you if you would wait here a few minutes for me. Nick went into another room, where he knew that Patsy was waiting. A set of signals is arranged in Nick's house, by which he always knows when one of his staff gets in. Patsy, said Nick, there's a fellow upstairs whom you'll have to shadow. Gaspard?
No, a man who calls himself Hammond.
Gaspard has identified him as the man who was in room A. Look here, said Patsy. Am I a farmer, or is this man Gaspard the greatest living identifier? What do you mean? Why, it strikes me that he picked out his men a good deal too easy. If it's all straight, I'd like the loan of his luck for a few days. That identification on the elevated station looked to me like a fake. I don't believe he ever intended that you should get hold of the man. In my opinion, he's simply running around identifying everybody he sees. But this man Hammond admits it. Is he telling the truth? No, said Nick with a peculiar smile. I don't believe he is. Well then, Gaspard's a liar, and if he's lied here, he may have done the same thing in Jones's case. Nick looked shrewdly at his youthful assistant. He is very fond of this bright boy, and gives him every chance to develop his theories in those cases in which he's employed. Come, my lad, said the famous detective, tell me, what has you said against Gaspard? He's going to skip. Is that so? Well, this is serious.
It's a fact. I got it from one of the men in the restaurant. My man was told of it by Corbett.
Corbett? Yes. And there's another suspicious circumstance. There's a French woman who is going to give little old New York the shake at the same time as Gaspard. They're going back to sunny France together. Now, nobody knows this but the man I talked with. Gaspard thinks that Corbett was the only one who knew it. So it was for Gaspard's interest, in case he really did this job and lifted some valuable plunder off that woman, to get Corbett out of the way. Did he pay Corbett to skip first? And is he now identifying Tom, Dick, and Harry for the purpose of bothering us and keeping us busy until he can light out? It's worth looking into, said Nick. At any rate, you stick to Gaspard. I'll put somebody else on to Hammond. Chapter 6. Mrs. John Jones. Nothing of great importance occurred in the case until the next afternoon, when Nick was at police headquarters. He was talking with Superintendent Burns. The identification of that woman gets stronger all the time, said the superintendent. I'm beginning to think she really is the wife of our prisoner. It looks so, said Nick. At that moment a card was brought in. The superintendent looked at it and whistled softly. Then he handed the card to Nick, who read the name. The two men exchanged glances, and both smiled. Mrs. John Jones, said Nick. Well, this puts a new face on the matter. It's a great case, was the reply. I'm mighty glad you happened to be on the scene at once. He turned to the officer who had brought the card and directed that Mrs. Jones should be admitted immediately. A pretty young woman entered. She was of about the same height as the unfortunate victim of the tragedy in the restaurant and much like her in build. The faces did not resemble each other in outline, but the coloring was similar. There was a faint resemblance in the large, light blue eyes. The hair was of the same peculiar shade and nearly as luxuriant, but nobody would have ever mistaken one woman for the other after a fair look at their faces. The costumes, however, were positively identical. Mrs. John Jones, to all appearances, wore the very same clothes as Nick had seen upon the woman in room B. Mrs. Jones was evidently very nervous, but she made a fine attempt to control herself. "You have my husband under arrest, I believe," she said, "and he is accused, they say, of killing me?" She tried to smile, but it was a rather ghastly effort. The superintendent motioned the woman to a seat. "Mr. John Jones is here," he said, "and he is suspected of murder." "I have read about it," replied the woman. "There certainly appeared to be evidence against him, but of course you must be aware that I know him to be innocent." "How?" "Because I was with him when the crime was committed. At 7:30 of the evening, we were walking toward the great Central Depot. We had dined at our flat. The people who say they saw us go out tell the truth. But we came back. It was my intention to take an afternoon train, but I decided to wait. So we came back and had dinner. Nobody saw us go in or out of the flat. After dinner, we walked to the depot, and I took the 8:10 train for my home in Maysville, 10 miles from Albany. I arrived in Albany Wednesday morning and remained there with friends throughout the day and night. Then I went to Maysville, where I heard the news, and came back at once." The superintendent touched his bell. 2 minutes later, John Jones was brought into the room. "Amy!" exclaimed he. "How came you here?" He ran up to her, and they greeted each other affectionately. The woman, who had controlled herself up to this point, burst into tears. Jones turned in wrath toward Nick. "Haven't we had enough of this infernal nonsense?" he exclaimed. "You have raised the devil with my business and scared my wife into a fit. Now let me out and arrest the Emir of Afghanistan. He had more to do with this affair than I did." Nick did not reply, but he made a secret sign to the superintendent. "You are at liberty, Mr. Jones," said Burns calmly. "I regret that it was necessary to detain you so long." "I have no complaint to make against you," said Jones. "It was that man's work, and he shall pay for it." He scowled at Nick, and then, after bowing to the superintendent, walked out of the room with his wife on his arm. "Shall I call a man?" said Burns. "If you please," said Nick. My force is pretty busy." "Musgrave!" said the superintendent. A man appeared so suddenly that he seemed to come out of the wall. "Shadow the couple that has just left here," said Burns. "You are under Mr. Carter's orders until dismissed by him." Musgrave turned to Nick. "I have no special instructions," said Nick, "except that you keep your eyes on the woman." The officer saluted and vanished almost as quickly as he had come in. At 7:30 that evening, Musgrave was on guard outside the flat, the address of which had been given to Nick by Jones. An old man selling papers came along the street, calling, "Extra!" in a cracked voice. Musgrave bought a paper. "Well," said the newsman in Nick Carter's voice, "what have you to report?"
From headquarters, they went to an employment agency on 6th Avenue. They engaged a colored girl as a servant. Then they came straight here, and the girl followed them. Mr. and Mrs. Jones have not been out since.
"Are you sure of that?"
"Perfectly. There is no way to get out of that house from the rear.
"How about the fire escape?"
There is only that one on the side which you can see. The little yard back of the house is walled in by buildings."
"So Mr. and Mrs. Jones must be inside?"
"Yes."
"And the girl?"
"She is out. She has been going on errands 6 times, but usually to the grocer's or the butcher's round the corner. I don't know where she has gone this time. She's been out about a quarter of an hour."
"All right. I'm going over there." Nick changed his disguise to that in which Jones had seen him. He did it in the hall of the flat house, while waiting for the door to be opened in answer to his ring. Jones met him on the upper landing. "Look here," said Jones when he recognized Nick. "Isn't this going a little too far? What do you want now?" "I would like to ask Mrs. Jones a few questions if you have no objections." "I object very seriously." "Will you ask her if she is willing to see me?" "No, I won't." "Then I shall have to use my authority." Don't do that. Come now, be a good fellow. Amy is sick with all this worry. She's just gone to bed. Let her alone until tomorrow." "I will," said Nick. "Good night." He descended the stairs and rejoined Musgrave, who was standing in a dark place on the opposite side of the street. "Have you seen a light in that window?" asked Nick, pointing to the flat. "No." "Then Jones lied to me a minute ago when he said that his wife had just gone to bed. That window is in the principal bedroom of the flat." "There's been no light there." "Then they fooled you, Musgrave."
"What do you mean?"
"I mean that Mrs. Jones is out."
"Oh, it can't be possible."
"It's true. She's gone out disguised as her own servant."
"I can't believe it. Why, the girl's black as your hat."
"That's why they engaged her, in my opinion. It made the trick easier. A blackface is a good disguise. But I'm going to be sure about it."
"How?"
"I'm going to see whether the colored girl is in the flat."
"How can you get in?"
"I'm going down the air shaft. The servant's room opens on that shaft. They'll have made her go in there so her light won't show, as it would if she were in the kitchen." Nick went to an engine house nearby, where he secured a coil of knotted rope. He wished to make his investigation secretly, so as not to put Jones on his guard. It would not have been safe to get into the flat by the ordinary methods. By using the fire escape of the building next door to the flat house, Nick got to the roof. The top of the air shaft was covered with a framework in which large panes of glass were set. Nick removed one of them. Then he made his rope fast and crept through the space where the glass had been. The Joneses' flat was next to the top, so Nick had a short descent. But there was an awful stretch of empty air under him as he hung there. The shaft went to the basement floor about 70 feet below the level of the window which opened into the room occupied by the Joneses' new servant. He found that window readily. One glance through it was enough to satisfy him. There sat the colored girl reading a book. Nick's suspicions had been correct. Naturally, he did not delay very long in the air shaft. He had a hard climb to make, hand over hand, to the roof. The instant that his eyes rested on the girl, he began the ascent. He had gone up less than 6 feet when the rope suddenly gave way, and he found himself plunging downward through the shaft. Have we seen the last of Nick Carter? Where has Mrs. Jones gone, and why? And who is the mysterious woman who is still at the center of this case? The answer to these questions and more will be found out in the next thrilling chapter of Nick Carter and the Crime of the French Cafe. Well, things are getting very interesting. Now, before we go, I'd like to thank once again the hard-working crew over at Project Gutenberg for keeping this story, and so many others, alive and well. Hop on over to their website to check out all their amazing stories. That's Gutenberg.org, O-R-G. Well, until next time, folks, thanks for listening, keep sharing your stories, and be a good human. Bye for now.